All right, looks like we still have people trickling in, but that's fine. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here today, everyone. My name is Lillian Patil. I'm the Senior Analyst of State and Local Budgets at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, where we use state teams and we partner with advocate partners nationwide to try and end harmful government practices of profiting off communities and families through the collection of fines and fees. I'm happy to be with you here today to introduce the second episode of our new budget webinar series. This one all about how to analyze a fiscal note, which I hope will be a timely topic for many of you because I know a lot of states are currently going through their legislative sessions. And so many of you in advocacy organizations may be advocating for a particular piece of fine and fee reform legislation that's going through the legislative process right now and inevitably will likely have a fiscal note at some point during that process. My previous career before coming to FFJC was based in different government executive budget roles, where I often interacted with fiscal notes, both in terms of authoring them and analyzing them and responding to them. So I'm very aware that fiscal notes can both be an incredible challenge and can be an obstacle in getting a legislative reform to the finish line through the legislative process, but also can be an incredibly important, informative, and impactful tool used to help advance your reform. And so my goal today is to help you understand as best as possible how you can use fiscal notes to advance the reforms that you're working on. So we'll start out with the basics today of what is a fiscal note, and we'll talk through some strategies for how to decode or analyze them and peel back the layers behind that single net impact or price point that you often see. Then we'll talk about some different strategies and examples for how to respond to fiscal note using a couple of real-world examples from legislation recently passed in New Mexico and Nevada. We'll leave some time for questions at the end. And one more thing I want to point out before we get started is many of the concepts that we'll talk about or reference today about more of the basics of budgeting. So government budgeting, balancing expenditures versus revenues, looking at different fund structures, including the general fund and others. All of these we cover in more detail in our first episode of our budget webinar series called How to Read a Budget Book. And so definitely if you want to get some more of those basics and learn more about budget books and reading budgets, encourage you to check out that first webinar. It's up on our Clearinghouse website. Our comms team is going to put it in the chat right now, and you can access it for free at any time. We're also recording this webinar today, so we will also put that online for free access after the webinar, so you can access it whenever you'd like. All right, so getting started with some basics. What is a fiscal note? A fiscal note is a legislative document that provides an estimate of how implementing a certain piece of legislation would change government revenues and or expenditures. So it either raise new revenue for the government, take away revenue that's currently going into a certain agency for operations, and change costs to make them either higher or lower on what governments would need to spend in order to successfully implement a piece of legislation. Usually you can find fiscal notes online at whatever link you can find online documentation of the legislation itself. And sometimes fiscal notes are updated as a piece of legislation moves through the process and gets amended and goes through different committees. Sometimes it is not, but usually it becomes a really important piece of information and document that lawmakers reference, especially during the budget or appropriations committee phase of the legislative process, to consider the different trade-offs involved from the fiscal standpoint of what it would mean to implement a piece of legislation. For fines and fees reform, this fiscal notes often show up as revenue impacts because generally when you're trying to eliminate a particular fine or fee, you have to go in and take a revenue stream that was up to this point funding different operations, services, staff in one or more agencies, and you kind of pull that out and take it away. And what that can sometimes, not always, as we'll talk about later, but what that can sometimes leave is this revenue hole that needs to be filled or reallocated in order to make sure that the planned spending of grants and programs and services in that agency isn't put at risk. Those of us who do advocacy in fines and fees reform know that the fiscal note can often be a stuck point or a really big obstacle in a successful legislative campaign for fines or fee reform. And that can be because no matter how much legislators may say, we love this idea in theory, we really agree with this policy change, it would be an important and impactful change for residents. Sometimes it's really hard to get past that question of where would the money come from? If there's a really big price point or representing a fiscal impact of passing a piece of legislation and lawmakers say there isn't enough money for this, that can be a hard obstacle to overcome. But as we're about to talk about, fiscal notes at their essence are built on a series of assumptions and assumed conditions about a fiscal environment that are not necessarily set in stone and that involve making a lot of choices about what you think is going to best represent what's going to happen in the future. And by having the tools to uncover those layers of assumptions and choices and conditions, you give yourself power to be able to think about where you agree or disagree with what goes into that number and gives you power to then respond to and advocate for change to that fiscal note. So in order to do that, we start off by just talking about the very basic common elements of fiscal notes. When you first look at a fiscal note, you'll usually see an author and a date of publication. Author is important, we're going to talk about in a minute, but you will sometimes see agencies themselves as the authors of fiscal notes. So the agency that's going to feel the impact of a certain piece of legislation at the fiscal level will submit information about what they think that impact will be, and that just gets submitted as the fiscal note. Sometimes, in contrast, there will be nonpartisan or sort of third-party teams of fiscal analysts, sometimes held within the legislature, sometimes held within the executive branch, who analyze and produce the fiscal notes as part of their primary job. So they solicit information from agencies, but then they have sort of an extra layer of review and analysis before producing it. And we'll talk in a minute about why that can be so important. And then date of publication, this is really handy to keep your eye on just so that you know if a fiscal note is being updated as legislation gets updated or not. Then you'll usually see in fiscal notes a quick summary of the bill itself. This is a really handy tool. I often will go into fiscal notes just not even for the fiscal stuff yet, but just to understand what's going on a particularly thorny or long piece of legislation, because they generally have really nice, concise paragraphs that give you a really quick hit of what all is happening in the bill. And then hopefully right at the front of the fiscal note, there will be some sort of table or paragraph that tells you about the net overall impact that overall the government expects to see in terms of revenue and expenditure changes as a result of implementing this legislation, and what funds or what areas of the government and what agencies would be affected by that change. And then lastly, hopefully, depending on how your fiscal notes in your jurisdiction are set up and designed, hopefully you will have some to a lot of line item detailed narrative. And this is really like the meat of the fiscal note, where you can start to look to really uncover all of those different layers of assumptions and choices and calculations by looking for clues in the narrative that tells you how each agency or each line item, how the fiscal estimate for that piece of the overall fiscal impact estimate was calculated. So once you've kind of identified those common elements, then you can start to think through how to decode or analyze a fiscal note. And this, again, is the process of taking a final number, which can seem very complete or concrete, can seem immovable, and saying, what are all the different layers of assumptions, calculations, data used that went into getting those numbers, so that you can start to pick apart or reverse engineer how someone got to the estimate that they did, and give yourself the power to decide for each one of these pieces, do I agree or disagree with the way that they came, the conclusion that they came to and the assumption that they used. And this is where it becomes very important to understand that budgeting is essentially an art just as much as it is a science. And that's because writing fiscal notes and budgeting, government budgeting overall, at some level has to base itself on making a certain set of assumptions about the types of fiscal conditions and programmatic implications that will arise in the future with the implementation of a certain piece of legislation. We can't know the future. It's not set in stone. So the best we can do is come up with what we know to be true in the present or the past, make certain assumptions about what conditions will or won't be there in the future, and try and use that information to mimic what we think is going to happen in the future to take our best guess about how much revenue or expenditure we need to plan for in appropriating money for a certain, in the budget or for a certain piece of legislation. And it's really in uncovering those assumptions and then evaluating them that you give yourself the power to be able to respond to a fiscal note and make different assumptions, which can end up leading to a very different number. So we'll talk about some very concrete tips to do that. The first suggestion I always have is, first thing when you're looking at a fiscal note, consider the author and then consider the possible biases or incentives they may have in writing the fiscal note itself. Who writes the fiscal note can tell you a lot about the number that they came up with. And this is because if agencies are the primary ones who are writing the fiscal notes, they sometimes, not always, but sometimes can have in sort of like ingrained incentive to be more conservative in their projections and their calculations. And that doesn't mean say things that are not true. It just means be more conservative and assume less risk in their calculations, which may lead to a slightly bigger fiscal impact. Because the revenue that's proposing to be eliminated in a finer fee reform goes directly into their funds and funds their operations. And because once a budget is passed or legislation is passed and appropriations are made, it kind of becomes final for the next fiscal year, there's limited ability in the middle of the year if the department finds out, oh, actually the revenue hit was bigger than we thought, for them to figure out how to scrounge around and find enough money to be able to continue the operations and spending that they had planned. And so just inherently, when departments submit information, sometimes I assume that they may be more conservative in their projections than, for example, a sort of third-party legislative staff team of fiscal analysts who doesn't have that same direct connection to where the money is going and then being lost from, and may be able to give it that extra level of review and analysis and have additional capacity before consolidating conclusions and putting out the note. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then who the author is also can help you understand what sort of assumptions they have made in order to make projections and come up with calculations, and to help you pinpoint what kind of data is used. So where the data used in the calculations to come up with a fiscal estimate is coming from. And so in many cases, especially when you're looking at fine and fee reform, the fiscal impact may say, okay, well, we think that if you eliminate this one fee, it will cause a revenue impact of X dollars in revenue. And the way we got the X dollars is we looked at how much is being collected by that agency for that particular fee right now. So they may take a previous year's worth of data to then project what's going to happen for that same revenue stream in future years if it's eliminated. There are certain assumptions that a department makes when they choose to use 1 year versus another year's worth of data. And that's because no one year looks the same. And to take kind of an extreme example, if you were trying to come up with a fiscal estimate for what the revenue impact of eliminating one particular fine would be, starting in the year fiscal 2025 and moving onwards, it probably is not going to be the best idea to pull data on revenue collections for that fine from, say, fiscal 20. And the reason for that is that was the first fiscal year that saw the huge brunt of the onset of the COVID pandemic. And almost all government revenues everywhere just shot straight down. And there was a lot of really unique fiscal conditions that made revenue collections for that year for most types of revenue look very different from previous years. And so it may not be the best representation of what's going to happen in the future. And so it may not be the best assumption to make that it's a good proxy for what you think would happen in fiscal 2025, versus if you took, data from 2018, for example, that might be a better proxy, because you might say, I'm assuming that fiscal conditions in 2018 are going to more realistically match what fiscal conditions are going to look like in 2025. But it's also like a long time ago. So then there is also an assumption that like moving a few years further back won't impact changes that you might see in a few years in the future. A fiscally responsible strategy that is often employed, and that always makes me feel better when I see it employed in fiscal notes, is to take the average of multiple years worth of collection data and use that average as a way to kind of cancel out any noise or unique conditions that may occur from any one fiscal year and come up with a nice middle ground. On average, this is the magnitude of general revenue collection that we are usually seeing. and can often serve as a proxy that doesn't force you to make as many stark assumptions on any one given year. Often, if departments can't track down the specific revenue, as we all know, it can be pretty hard to follow the money sometimes with fines and fees. And so if a department or an agency doesn't have that data handy for what revenue collections look like directly, they may use some level of formulas to come up with a best guess fiscal estimate of the impact of eliminating a fine or fee stream. And that could look something as basic as saying, we're going to take X population assumption. So assuming that X population, X number of people per year are paying this one fee times Y, how much we think the fee is right now on average for each person, gets you to Z price point. That's a very basic formula that could be reasonably used to come up with a fiscal estimate if you don't have the specific data handy. But sometimes there also need to be other assumptions or conditions built into those formulas to, again, make it as realistic as possible to best mimic and estimate what's going to happen in the future. So that can mean anything from like, does the department need to adjust multiple years out price points by inflation to account for rising costs of living? Do they need to show a different estimate for 2 years from now versus 1 year from now based on how the pace of the implementation rollout is going to look like? There are a lot of different like assumptions or adjustments that can be put into place, and that the narrative behind fiscal notes can help you understand if and when the departments did that, so that you can identify, were those the right assumptions to make? Were those the right adjustments to make? And if not, what do I think the right assumptions are? One other important thing that's important to notice when you're analyzing a fiscal note is to notice the recommendations that the note ultimately makes for backfill, which means filling any hole left when you pull a revenue stream out of a budget or out of an agency's fund that might need to be filled in other ways by other revenue streams. And it's very common in fiscal notes for the fiscal note to assume that a backfill will be needed to make up for any lost revenue from fines and fees in order to not put agency operations at risk. But that is an assumption in itself as well. There also is a world sometimes where agencies can absorb revenue loss, where they don't necessarily need to get dollar for dollar the same amount of revenue from another source, because they can either reallocate the other dollars they do have to kind of stretch their dollars and make it work, or they can find ways to find efficiencies and minimize expenditures or spending in other ways so that you just don't need as many total revenue dollars. Sometimes, even if you do need another revenue resource, it doesn't always have to be general fund. Sometimes you can be looking for fund balance that may exist in the agency that can be used to cover revenue holes for a few years. So there, again, are assumptions and choices and options in the idea of like, what do we do about a revenue impact that are sometimes put forward in fiscal notes as a given, but are not necessarily always have to be a given. I see a question in the chat. What's the meaning of a shortfall in a fiscal note? Great question. So this basically means, I would assume that this is referring to a fiscal note saying that there's going to be a revenue impact or increased costs. And that means in this fund or in this agency, there is not enough money planned to come in to be able to cover all the dollars that are planned to go out or be spent. And so that creates what's called a shortfall. And if we don't come up with another revenue source, then you can't spend all the money that you were planning to spend on all the operations you were planning to do. And again, that shortfall can sometimes be very, very real. And then sometimes there can be solutions in other ways by like finding efficiencies, et cetera. So again, that's something to sort of look for when you're analyzing a fiscal note so you can decide for yourself if you agree. Now we're going to look at a couple examples of actual fiscal notes from the last year that our FFJC teams have worked on recently that can provide examples of how you can go through and use these tools and tips around decoding and analyzing fiscal notes. Our first one comes from New Mexico. Last year, our New Mexico state team worked very closely with advocate partners and legislators to lead on successfully passing the court fee elimination bill, HB 139, which eliminated, I think, 9 different types of post-adjudication fees that were imposed automatically on people moving through their criminal legal system. And so because it affected 9 different fees, it there was a significant impact from multiple different agencies who were seeing revenue come into their funds at one point or another from one or more of these fees. And so the fiscal note was pretty long and pretty thorough, and I think provides a really good example of how you can uncover some of these assumptions and choices in data. So we'll look first at the first page. I'm first going to scan and look for the author and the date of publication. I see right at the top that the Legislative Finance Committee is a fiscal analysis team within the legislature that's in charge of collecting information on fiscal estimates from agencies and then doing that analysis themselves and producing the notes. So there is that extra level review, and that's like a green flag that goes off on my head. I'm always happy to see that when there's that sort of standing body whose sole job is to, in a like nonpartisan, unbiased way, be able to examine estimates and data coming in and then publish the fiscal notes from there. I'm also happy to see that for date of publication, there's an original date of March 3rd there, and then there's another updated date of March 16th. That tells me that as the bill is going through the legislature and getting amendments added to it, that the fiscal note is in turn being updated. And so I don't have to worry about doing manual adjustments of going back to the bill and saying like, okay, what's not in the fiscal note that's now in the bill, et cetera. And then here they give us, again, on the first page of the fiscal note, a nice, neat net impact number. So they're saying starting in fiscal year 25, the total impact of eliminating all of these 9 different court fees is going to result in about $6.8 million revenue loss. The reason I know it's a loss is I see those parentheses around the revenue number. And they think that number is recurring, which means it's expected to happen every single year because the fines will no longer be collected in any year in the future. I'm continuing on the first page. This is just lower down on the first page of the fiscal note. Here they give us that nice quick summary of the bill, telling us that it's eliminating a bunch of different post-adjudication court fees. And then it gives us a really handy bullet pointed list of all the different funds where revenue is currently going. And that's really useful if you're trying to do an exercise to like find the money or just understand which agencies and which operations are going to be impacted by no longer collecting revenue from those fees. And so the fiscal note over the next several pages goes into each one of those funds and looks at what percentage or what part of the overall $6.8 million revenue impact is expected to come from each one of those funds and what will happen if a backfill is not identified. So I'm going to show you 2 examples of paragraphs that dive into these funds that I think are really good examples of how important it is to sort of dig through and identify the different assumptions and choices that are made in calculations. The first one is looking at the brain injury services fee, which is one of those eliminated in the bill, and which up to this point had been going to the Human Services Department into their brain injury services fund to fund services to people with traumatic brain injuries statewide. So in the first paragraph, the Human Services Department has clearly submitted an estimate of what they think that will impact them. And they're saying currently they receive about $600,000 in fee revenue. So once that revenue goes away, they're going to essentially like lose $600,000 of revenue for these services. And at first glance, I would say like, oh, well, it seems important then to come up with $600,000 worth of another revenue source because it seems important that we don't have to cut this very important service. However, in the second paragraph, it becomes clear that 600,000 is not necessarily the be-all end-all number here because the LFC also asked the courts, the administrative office of the courts, who are on the front lines of like collecting the fee, what their estimate of the revenue impact is for this fee. And they gave a very different number. Theirs is closer to 250,000, very different from 600,000. And that signals to me that there's either different sources of data that are being used for each estimate or different assumptions that each department may be making. And so now I'm going to sort of go back in and see if I can uncover what some of those assumption or choices might be. In the first paragraph, I don't really see much more from the Human Services Department about how they got that $600,000 number, other than they think that is the collections. It doesn't sound like they built out a formula to estimate it. It sounds like they were able to pinpoint and say, we see the dollars coming in and it's $600,000. I don't know what year they pulled that from. That is a variable. That's a question. In the second paragraph, I have a little bit more information about how the courts got their number. They specifically point out that they used a 5-year average between fiscal 17 and 21. to get to that $250-ish thousand number. And that makes me, again, that's always like a green flag that goes off in my mind when I see like an average over a number of recent years. And additionally, as we talked about before, I'm wondering if the Human Services Department might have a little more incentive to be more conservative and so show a slightly higher revenue impact, because they're the ones who are going to, it's their operations that are going to be impacted by this fee going away, not the courts. The courts aren't getting this money in the first place. And so they might not have that incentive to be less conservative. And so I don't want to discount the Human Services number, certainly, because again, it's their fund. It's like, should be their data that they are able to have. But I don't want to discount the court's estimate either, because I understand why theirs might be a little bit lower, and I kind of more clearly see where their data is coming from. So I kind of came to the same conclusion that the LFC did, which I'm happy to see, that they used a conservative estimate of 325,000. So they took both estimates and they kind of landed somewhere in the middle so as not to discount either one, which I think is a fairly balanced and reasonable approach. They also said that follows pre-pandemic wages or averages. And I appreciate that they kind of took, again, that COVID noise, that unique situation that happened during COVID out of the equation to hopefully use data that best mimics what actually will happen in future years. Now we'll look at one more example around bench warrant fees. So this was another fee that got eliminated and in this bill, and it was a big one. It was a $100 fee that was assessed every time a bench warrant was issued by the courts. And this money was going directly to the courts. And so the revenue impact that's estimated here by the courts starts off by saying it's about $3 million. So that tells me the courts are saying that about $3 million is coming in bench warrant fee revenue every year that will no longer come in when it's eliminated. However, the next sentence starts to get a little more interesting. They say the operating budget impact may be as high as 3.5 million, which is like a $500,000 difference. So it's not insignificant. And then they say, depending on AOC implementation. That tells me that there's something else at play here in the estimate besides just the loss of revenue, because then they're also saying there may be this additional money that's needed to be backfilled. And then the words depending on AOC implementation tell me that there may be some assumption that AOC that the courts are making that may be either optional or scalable. So then I'm going to use the next few paragraphs to try and understand what those assumptions or those options might be. So the next paragraph tells me that the revenues from the warrant fee are currently being deposited into this court fund, which is being used and spent down to aid in the collection of those very fines and fees. So logically speaking, they're saying this bill will eliminate the fees. So we don't any longer have to spend money and time and staff resources on trying to collect them. And that opens up a world that almost gives me a third possible fiscal estimate of zero, because logically speaking, if the money that the fees were used for in the first place aren't even needed anymore, that spending, that programming isn't needed anymore, then maybe the revenue doesn't have to be backfilled and the courts wouldn't actually feel the loss. However, in the next paragraph, the courts explain why they would indeed feel the loss and why they need at least that 3 million and maybe up to 3.5. And what it turns out is they're saying, okay, we know that we won't need the resources to do collections work anymore, but we would like to keep the money we were using for that collections work. We would like to instead use it to fund new front-end compliance work to try and make sure people are getting to their hearings and being compliant with their hearing notices in the first place. So making phone calls to remind people about their hearings, making sure people have ways to get to court with transportation, et cetera. This is interesting because it is not unrelated to the bill in front of us and the idea of this bench warrant fee being eliminated, but it's not a direct result necessarily of the revenue going away. It feels like an optional initiative that the courts are saying is important, but doesn't have to happen as a result directly of losing the revenue. So it almost feels like a new initiative that they're packaging together with the fiscal estimate for this piece of legislation. And so that's where that scalability comes in. It seems like maybe depending on the number of like staff or resources that are provided for this front end work, you could be looking at anywhere from just backfilling all of the revenue that was lost, 3 million, to all the way up to 3.5 million. And so that's just, it's not necessarily bad or good. It's just helping me consider more deeply the different options aligned with any one of those numbers, so that if I wanted to respond to it or work with anyone I had relationships with at the court or in the legislature, I could talk about these numbers in the way that makes the most sense to me. And then notice that in terms of backfill, that they are suggesting that this should be funded with general fund revenue. So they're not necessarily open in the fiscal note to talking about use of fund balance or other types of resources or finding efficiencies elsewhere. So that's just something to notice, and then decide if that is something you agree with or not, or if that needs to be an additional conversation that you want to try to have as part of your advocacy strategy. Our next example, we're going to look at Nevada, and we're going to look at last year's Senate Bill 416, which targeted a number of different ways that the Department of Corrections was charging people money who were in Nevada, who were incarcerated in Nevada prisons. And this fiscal note looks pretty different from New Mexico, so I think it's going to be a good juxtaposition of the last example. Again, starting off by looking for the author and the date of publication, I see here that in contrast to New Mexico, the agency is the primary author of this fiscal note. They are making the estimates, they are writing the narrative, and the note is being produced as the agency is exactly as the agency has presented it. It looks like the Governor's Office of Finance is sort of giving it a cursory review, but only to say it appears reasonable. It does not appear they're going into depth and producing the note themselves. I also see there's only one date prepared. And if I went back to the website of the legislation and checked the different versions of the bill, I would see that even though the bill itself evolved and got amendments along the legislative process, there was only one fiscal note. So I would have to know that this fiscal note doesn't necessarily represent where the bill ended up at its final point at the end of session. Then we have, kind of similar to the last example, we have this table that represents the net fiscal impact that the Department of Corrections is projecting. So they are looking at total, they're saying about $6.1 million in revenue loss. Again, it's revenue loss because there are those parentheses. And they are saying that that's going to continue every year, that I see from those columns on the right. Then they break down the total impact projections by line items. This is all within the Department of Corrections, but they're saying out of that 6.1 million, we think 4.2 million revenue loss is going to come from no longer marking up commissary more than 5%. And there's going to be additional impact from no longer charging room and board fees to people who are in prison in Nevada and employed. Additional impact from forgiving outstanding debt when people are released from prison and making sure everyone who is released has at least $100 in their savings account, and then elimination of various types of medical copays. This is just zooming in on the previous fiscal note or on the previous page. This is the entire fiscal note. There are no further details. And as you can see in this zoomed in area, they don't give us very much in the narrative at all around assumptions and where they found their data and how they got to their numbers. Really, the only thing they talk about is that they do assume, or they do not assume, any increase in commissary sales that would happen as a result of lowering the markup prices, which is something you'll see in a minute that we thought about and then decided to respond to as an organization. But other than that, they give us next to nothing about how they came up with these numbers. And so at first glance, it can feel really challenging to figure out how to respond to any of them, how to know if we agree with them or not, if there's nothing there. And so now I'm going to actually pass it off to my colleague, Nick Shepak, who is the Deputy State Director here at FFJC on our Nevada team. And he is going to talk through some of the strategy that his team used really early on in the process of this bill, even before the fiscal note was created, to get our hands on some data that would be helpful to be able to contextualize and gut check the data, the numbers that you see here.
Thank you, Lillian, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Nick Shepak. I'm the State Deputy Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center here in Nevada. And so we learned lessons pretty early on here in Nevada. As you can see, the fiscal notes don't tell you a lot of information. And in previous sessions, what we learned is that often these notes can at least feel as though they're being weaponized. So people will put out this fiscal note, it'll often be much higher than you anticipated. And no matter what your policy is around it, if you don't have a good fiscal analysis ready, they can just kill a bill. So we learned that one of the most important things to do is come prepared. So what we did in order to do this, and what we do every time we run a bill here in the state, is we request as much information as we can, usually through the means of public records requests, as early as we can, up to a year in advance if we know we're going to be running a reform. The reason that we feel you need to request this data early is really twofold. One, often the data comes very raw. You get spreadsheet after spreadsheet, you get tons of documents that you have to dig through. And if you have somebody like Lillian, who's a budget expert on your team, you can do some of this analysis fairly quickly. If you're like a lot of organizations, you have to do this analysis yourself. And while it's totally doable, it can take a lot of time. And the second thing is, often these agencies drag their feet in providing this information. Many public records laws require that they respond within a few days or a few weeks, but often that's just to give a timeline. So for example, for this bill, when we put in a public records request for all their financial data surrounding all these fees, where it goes, all of that, they gave us a 9-month deadline to get the data, which was going to run us pretty close up to the legislative session. And so that brings me to my next point that is, I think, very helpful for everyone, is that what we did is we leveraged our relationships with legislators to get this information. We talked to the chair of the Senate Judiciary, who was very interested in this bill. They were going to run it as a committee bill. And we had her submit the records request on our behalf. And instead of that 9-month deadline for all of this financial information, we got the information in 2 weeks. So if you can leverage those political relationships when you're trying to get information early, or especially if you need that information quicker, those requests tend to get filled a lot faster. And it's extremely important to have all this information ahead of time, because it allows you to start running your own analysis on what your legislation is going to cost. So us working with Lillian and all the data we had, we were able to go into the session with, we think it's going to cost about this much. Now, there's going to be things you find through conversations with agencies and in fiscal notes where, oh, maybe we didn't see that. But it also allows you to push back immediately. You can say, hey, but what about this? Or you can show some numbers. And often, at least here in Nevada, if you do that type of work, you may end up being more prepared to talk about the fiscal impact of the state than the department actually is. As you can see in this note, they pulled some real quick numbers, threw them on to a sheet. There's not a lot of analysis available, and we were able to come with a deep analysis of what we thought the bill was going to cost. Another thing that is very important about having this data early is, one, it allows you to track your bill. You can request the same data after you pass your legislation, and you can actually see what the true impact is. You can check it against the fiscal note after you pass your reforms and see if the department was actually accurate, if you were more accurate, or if it was somewhere in the middle. And if you do this work and you can show it to the legislature, especially if your data ends up coming to be more accurate or fairly accurate compared to the department, it builds trust as you move forward, and they start saying, hey, maybe we do need to pay attention to these different organizations' analysis instead of just looking at these fiscal notes. And so by collecting all this data very early, running the analysis, and bringing that to the legislature, we set ourselves up in a really good position to push back against some of these numbers and achieve much of the reform that we were pushing for in this prison legislation. And I'll throw it back to Lillian now.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And Nick will be sticking around for questions at the end too, if anyone has specific questions about the strategy and work in Nevada that he's talking about. But as he mentioned, because of that really valuable data that he was able to get for us to work with, we did have some information that we could use to build our own formulas and try and imagine how NDOC could have come up with these numbers to gut check them and say, like, does this feel wildly off and like really needs to be challenged? Or does it feel more or less we understand how they got there and we agree with it? So for examples, for the copay elimination piece, we were able to get information on how many people had medical visits over the course of a year in Nevada prisons. And then we knew that copay visits were on average $8. And so we were able to do some simple formula multiplication and got a number that was not crazy far off from what NDOC has put here, which helped validate our understanding of, okay, we know where they got this number from and we feel okay about it. And then in some cases, we didn't feel okay about it and had to respond in other ways, which is what we're about to talk through now. So the last step of these tools and steps we're talking about is how do you respond to a fiscal note? So you've uncovered the assumptions, you've sort of peeled back all the layers. There are pieces you agree with, there are pieces of the full picture that you think are missing. You have some choices. As Nick pointed out, you can form relationships with the courts, with legislators, and work through them to try and get your analysis and your numbers in their hands and get legislators to bring them up at budget hearings. You can also sort of externally and by yourself try and publish your own analyses and data. That's what we're doing in New York right now. Our FFJC team is working on passing a bill to end predatory court fees in New York. And we recently did an analysis where we came up with a fiscal impact that was pretty significantly different from what the government's putting out right now. And so we recently published those findings in a white paper to try and explain our methodology and get that in the hands of legislators as they consider the trade-offs and like what this impact of the legislation would really be. So any way you sort of go about this, there are a few steps that you're going to want to take as you think through what are the best ways to go ahead and respond to a fiscal note and come up with potentially your own analysis or implications. The first, of course, can often be the hardest, is trying to find the money yourself. So if it's something like NDOC where there's no hints about where the data is coming from in a fiscal note, you might try and go on that search yourself. And if you've struggled with this in the past, I would certainly recommend checking out our previous budget webinar on how to read a budget book, because budget books often have really valuable sources and tables of data that can be really helpful to help you find the money and find receipts and tables about funds that can show you exactly how much and where fine and fee revenue is going. If you can't find the money in any public budget documents, of course, you can turn to open records requests, as I know many advocates do, which can be a really valuable tool and can uncover some really important data. I would suggest if you are trying to get your hands on data that tells you about a revenue stream and where the money is going and how much there is, in an open records request, I would suggest you ask the relevant agency, not only for how much they are collecting, but also how much they are projecting. And that means how much they're programming in the budget that they may be collecting all of, or only some of, or more than. And that can be really useful because, as we know, collection rates for fines and fees are often way below imposed rates or assessed rates. And so if a department is budgeting and planning, projecting that $10 million is going to come in to balance their budget, but collection rates are only at like 50% because of inability to pay, then the true fiscal impact is not going to be $10 million. It's going to be that $5 million. And it's really important. That's one of the sort of assumptions it's important to uncover and make sure that fiscal notes are talking about what's collected, not necessarily what's projected or imposed. And if the collections rate is indeed lower than what's being programmed or projected, you can make a really powerful argument that not only is this going to have less of a fiscal impact than we think, but this is a really unreliable revenue source because less is coming in than you're planning for every year, which puts valuable services and operations at risk. So isn't it a wonderful thing that we're trying to eliminate this unreliable revenue stream and replace it with a general fund or something more sustainable, more reliable that puts the budget and the people in a better place? Of course, if you cannot find the money on your own, you may have to make your own assumptions and formulas. And like I just talked about, try and backwards math your way into coming up with how, with your own numbers and plug in different variables into a formula, which may be as basic as like X population of people are paying the fee. Y is the average amount of fee per person paying, gets you to a Z price point. Sometimes it can be hard to find the data to go into those variables, of course. This is also where I recommend, again, going back to the budget book, particularly to sections on performance metrics, where you can often find really good information, as well as on public dashboards that governments may have set up around population numbers and how many people are doing this, how many people are exiting this, how many times a ticket is issued. That can be really helpful in filling in those formulas. You can also always consider using proxies or using data that comes from different jurisdictions other than your own and substituting it in as a reputable and realistic substitute for data in your own state if you don't have it. Sometimes, though, you may need to sort of do an adjustment or a right size to make that data from another jurisdiction applicable to yours. So, for example, if I was trying to come up with a formula to figure out if I'm waiving reinstatement fees for driver's license, like how much that's going to hit the DMV's revenue source. And I don't have the population of how many drivers are getting their licenses reinstated every year here, but I can find it from a neighboring state. I might want to take that number and then I might want to multiply it by the ratio of population share of my state compared to the population share of their state to try and right size it and make it as applicable as possible to my state so that the formula makes as much sense as possible. So you can play with it and you can build your basic formulas and then make adjustments here and there where you need to make the data you have fit and work for the situation you're looking at. And then, of course, you're going to want to try and fill in the full fiscal picture if it's not there already. Many of us know that fiscal notes for fines and fees reform is often very good at stating strong costs or like revenue hits of eliminating fines or fees, but less good at including all the many possible benefits of eliminating fines or fees. And these, as we know, can lead to very real savings in other areas of the government. We know it's incredibly expensive to try and collect on fines and fees. It takes a lot of staff, time, and resources throughout public safety and law enforcement departments. And when you are no longer collecting those fines and fees, it can lead to some collections, to some savings from no longer having to do that collections works. Additionally, when you put money back in people's pockets instead of taking it from them in the form of fines and fees, they may be better able to do things like pay rent, go to the grocery store, and they may be not needing to rely as much on public assistance programs that help with those things, which also ends up saving the government money. It's tricky to find really concrete numbers and ways to add these as sort of like net offsets to the fiscal cost or impact of a fiscal note. And that's because these savings often aren't super direct. It's not often like, okay, if I pay $1 less in this fee, I will have this many people, fewer people need to access homelessness services. It's usually not that direct. And that's why it can be hard to put concrete numbers into like a formula, but fiscal notes are there to provide legislators with the important fiscal context they need to make a responsible trade-off choice about whether or not this legislation should be implemented. And the savings piece is a very important part of that picture, an important part and piece of information for legislators to consider in that trade-off. And so even if you can't like add a number into the final net impact table to represent savings, certainly fiscal notes should be including narrative and referencing the different possible costs that could come about as a result of the elimination of the fines and fees. And then at the end of the day, there may just be a revenue impact, and that may be something that is unavoidable because you are removing a revenue stream from where there used to be one. And that often ends up being less in magnitude than the fiscal note starts it off being, because for many reasons, often those initial fiscal notes can show a sort of overinflated picture of the revenue impact, but sometimes there just is still a price point. And I do want to caution that we should not be trying to get the price point to zero just to have it be zero if there is in fact a revenue impact, because if you don't come up with a solution for backfilling revenue or figuring out the revenue impact at the time of passing the legislation, you run the risk of getting into trouble with the implementation of that legislation, the agency not having enough funding to fund their operations and services. And that can kind of come back around to haunt you or to have people look back and say like, oh, well, why did we do this? It didn't work. And we, of course, don't want that to happen. So it's important to make sure that the price point that remains, the fiscal impact in the final fiscal note, is realistic. But if it remains, there are often ways you can justify it. You can talk about how the revenue overall is growing in the general fund for the particular jurisdiction. And there's lots of wiggle room and lots of places to allocate and replace fine and fee revenue stream. You can talk about existing other fund balance or reserves that might be able to help fill the gaps for a number of years. Or you can just talk about why this reform and this legislation is so important and so aligned with the policies that legislators are saying that they're supposed to be standing for, that it is worth whatever the cost or whatever the revenue impact it's going to be. We're going to, for the sake of time, look only at Nevada for this as an example of thinking through these tips for responding to fiscal notes. And we're going to go back to that cost of incarceration bill. And I'm going to zone in specifically on, I think, again, for the sake of time, I'll zone in specifically on looking at how we responded to NDOC's estimate around how much it was going to cost them in revenue loss to limit commissary markup to only 5%. This is where we did step number one. We started to try and find the money on our own. And we were actually successful in this way because Nevada's budget is actually, in their budget book, is actually really detailed and technical. And they build out very technical and detailed line items for each of their departments and each of their funds. So this is their commissary fund within the Department of Corrections. And I can see really clearly here how much revenue they're making off their commissary. It's that store sales number. And I'm looking at the first column, this fiscal 21-22 actuals. Actuals means what actually came through the door. So it's telling me in reality, in fiscal year 2022, how much did they make off commissary sales? And then down below under the expenditure section, I see how much they spent in order to get the inventory. And so I can just use simple subtraction to get a profit number and then look at how much markup that profit represents based on their initial inventory purchase costs. From there, I was able to say, okay, well, in another world where they were only able to mark up this inventory by 5%, what would that number look like? And then again, simple subtraction helps me understand what would that revenue loss be if we were just looking at fiscal 22 and assuming that the years that follow look similar to fiscal 22. And the number we came up with was actually pretty similar to the number that NDOC put in there. So we didn't have a huge problem with that. But we did have a problem with the only assumption that they listed in their fiscal note, which is that they said they didn't want to account for any increase in sales. And we thought it was very logical and common sense that if stuff starts being cheaper, then people are probably going to buy more stuff. And we thought that that was an important thing to take into account to make the fiscal impact statement and estimate as realistic as possible, mimicking as well as we could what was actually going to happen in the future. So what we ended up doing is we didn't have any data from Nevada. Like we had no way to say how much we thought commissary sales would increase by once this markup was gone because it hadn't happened yet. But we did know of other jurisdictions that had implemented similar reforms. So we reached out to San Francisco, who a couple years prior to this had eliminated markups in their commissary, so a similar reform. And they told us that since that reform had been implemented, they saw commissary sales go up by 50%. So we thought that that was an important piece of evidence to show that, yes, probably sales will go up. Now, there's often like a political element to how you can sort of contextualize bringing in data from other jurisdictions. And we knew that if we just threw in that 50% number, that there would be legislators that were like, why are you bringing San Francisco numbers in here? That's not applicable to Nevada at all. That doesn't make sense. So what we decided to do instead is we ended up coming up with a memo that responded to NDOC's original projection. And we said, first, we agree with the way that you got to your revenue loss numbers in terms of limiting commissary markup. But we believe that an additional offset should be added to account for increased sales. And instead of taking that full 50% increase that San Francisco saw, we anticipated pushback and we said, okay, we'll be even more conservative. Instead of saying 50%, we'll say only 22% in items, increase in items sold. And we assume that you'll have to buy some more inventory. And if we still take that conservative assumption, we're still going to see almost $1 million, $824,000 of projected additional revenue, which lowers the ultimate revenue hit that NDOC would see because of those higher sales totals. And so we recommend an adjusted number that was significantly lower than what they had in the first place. It is 12:55, so I think I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. Again, Nick is here and happy to talk more about Nevada specifically. But in summary, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip past my last example that I ran out of time for. But in summary, just when you're analyzing fiscal notes, it's so important to first identify who wrote it and try and uncover the assumptions and data that they used so you can evaluate it and give yourself the power to agree or disagree with different pieces of how they got to that number. And then build your own price points if you need to, do your own data research if you need to, come up with your own assumptions if you need to, and try and convince legislators to take that analysis and those assumptions into account. And at the end of the day, if there's a cost still there, if there's a revenue impact at the end of the day, there are many things you can do to justify and contextualize that cost to get to build as much momentum as you possibly can to use the fiscal note to advance your fiscal reform. So I'll go ahead and stop it right here so we can leave a few minutes for questions. I'm going to look in the chat. So are there instances when the agency putting together the fiscal note will use exaggerated numbers to dissuade the legislation from moving forward? Great question. Nick, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I would love to. So the short answer is yes. This can happen. How widespread it is really depends on where you are. So a prime example for that we had here in Nevada that really led me to make sure that we do all this front end work is when I worked for a different organization and organizations I work with now, we work on solitary confinement reform. We had a director of the Nevada prison system who was anti this type of reform 2 sessions ago. Nevada meets every other year. So not this last session, but the session before. We ran a bill. It had language that came from Vera, who came to Nevada in order to assess what Nevada could do. They technically had to be neutral when testifying on the bill, but they dropped a fiscal note of over $50 million and very late, as late as they technically could in the session. That huge fiscal note just absolutely killed the bill. And you saw how Nevada's fiscal notes look. They didn't have to be a lot of detail. A lot of it was staff or capital improvements was the only thing it said. We had no real way of pushing back. We hadn't done the fiscal analysis. And so they effectively killed the bill while testifying in neutral through the fiscal note process. We ran the exact same bill, language exact same, refiled the bill this last session with a different director who was looking to do this type of reform. And his note was about a little over $1 million. And by working with them, we were able to get it to zero. So it became abundantly clear that the fact that the department did not want to implement the reform, they used the fiscal note as the way of blocking the legislation.
Yeah, and this definitely happens sometimes. Luckily, it's not all the time. In my experience working with departments from the government side, more often than not, I have seen departments earnestly actually wanting to get the right price point, but just the assumptions and the conditions that they think will hold in a future year may not be the same as advocate organizations, may have different information and sometimes more expertise based on their work. That changes the number. But yes, as Nick said, sometimes there is just like the egregious example of the picture, the full picture being hidden or exaggerated. Any other questions? So our comms team just put in the chat, but yes, we will be posting this video on our YouTube channel next Monday. Great. One more question here. If a department's not detailed, how can one accurately oppose the fiscal note? Yeah, that's a good question. I would always start if you have any sort of relationship with either a legislator who can get that information from the department that submitted the fiscal note estimate, or sometimes there will be like the name of a fiscal note team member if it's a separate team that wrote the fiscal note. And sometimes you can literally reach out to the fiscal note office on your own and ask if they have any detail. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a good first step and first try. And then from there, if you can't get anything, this is where you kind of have to like try and reverse engineer how they like different ways they possibly could have gotten to a note. Like Nick was talking about, we had some different sources of data from open records requests on medical copay issues that we got separate from the fiscal note, and we kind of plugged and played it to see, is there a way we could get to the same number so that we can understand their assumptions, even though they didn't explicitly list them out for us. Okay, looks like that might be the end of questions, and we are at time. So I'll just end by noting, thank you all for being here and talking about this very important topic. I hope it was useful to your legislative sessions this year and beyond. And similar to the last webinar, we will also be sending out a quick message to get your feedback on the webinar. We will be doing future episodes, budget-related webinar episodes as well in the coming months. And we'd really like to make sure that we're producing content and information that is most useful to you and what you need for your advocacy campaigns. So it'll take less than a minute. We just put in the chat a link you can go to give your feedback on how this went for you and what you'd like to see in the future. With that, thank you all and have a wonderful day.